Ni hao. Thank you for having me here. Thought I would spend a very quick 10 minutes just giving you an update on the Hyperledger project and a lot of really exciting things happening for us here in China. My hope is that if you're not already looking at this technology or playing with it, that this inspires you to kind of give it a look and to think about some of the ways that it can be used to solve some real-world problems today. So Hyperledger, as again many of you know, we're a project hosted, embedded entirely inside the Linux Foundation, like many of the other projects here. It's a 3-year-old open source project to advance cross-industry blockchain technologies. And when we think about blockchain technology, it's not really the cryptocurrency side of that. That's interesting, and there's a lot of people focused on that. This is really more about the use of 2 technologies in particular, distributed ledgers and smart contract systems, and lots of different ways that that plays out. But this has been a 3-year-long effort to go and build a series of technologies that make it possible for you to go out and build blockchain networks. And just in the same way that the Linux Foundation has a whole set of projects like Hyperledger, even within Hyperledger, we have a whole series of projects. We call it the Hyperledger Greenhouse to try to get across the sense that these are technology projects that are distinct from each other, but they share a lot of things in common. They share a common operating system open source license, the Apache license, of course, right? They share a common development methodology. This is all built out in the public. But they offer some very different features and functionality. And I won't go into too much depth. There's a lot more information on the Hyperledger website. But just to give kind of a taste, so many of you perhaps have heard of Hyperledger Fabric. Fabric is very widely deployed. I'll show some information about it later, about how widely it's used, and a bunch of examples of where it's being used. And it's a very mature platform now for building all sorts of different blockchain applications. But even within Hyperledger, we have competition, because we believe very strongly, just like in databases and programming languages and even in operating systems, sometimes it's good to have a set of options when you go out to try to solve a problem, right? And there's a lot of different ideas out there about the right way to do a distributed ledger, the right way to do a smart contract. So we have another project called Sawtooth, which takes a very different approach to this. Sawtooth has some novel attributes that make it easier to plug many different kinds of smart contract engines in, as well as support much larger networks of nodes on a permissioned and perhaps even unpermissioned network basis. Other projects at Hyperledger are focused on digital identity, for example, Hyperledger Indy, very much on that, and others that go up the stack, so to speak, to start thinking about whole categories of use cases that might be appropriate for this. So Hyperledger Grid, for example, is very much focused on supply chain applications. You can pick up Grid, it happens to run on top of Sawtooth, and very quickly have a supply chain traceability solution in place. Lots of other things to talk about, but we're really moving in the direction of components and libraries and templates that'll allow for a lot of mixing and matching. Partly because we believe what will happen in the long term is all these different blockchain technologies out there in the world will start to consolidate, will start to combine, and maybe converge in the same way that the Linux operating system converged a lot of the server operating system world over the last 20 years. And we'd like to be there to help that convergence be a very graceful kind of process for users of blockchain technology out there. So lots of things to investigate in here. A lot of momentum in the public project. I won't spend too much time on this, but again, in 3 years, we've had lots of different projects launched, lots of different people take our edX course, over 100,000 different people taking the public training about how to build a Hyperledger network. We have a whole lot of members as part of Hyperledger. In fact, and Hyperledger Fabric itself has gotten very widely deployed out there. In fact, every major public cloud now supports Hyperledger Fabric. Both inside of China, so Baidu, Tencent, Ali, and Huawei, on all of their public clouds, they offer the ability to stand up a Fabric node or even a full Fabric network, as well as build up networks that span multiple clouds at the same time. But also all the public clouds outside of China support that as well. And it's really hard to get a sense for market share, like how many people are using Hyperledger technologies for enterprise blockchain applications versus the competitors. There's not a lot of competitors. There's a couple that are known as Corda and Quorum and some of the public Ethereum or even enterprise Ethereum clients arguably are competition here or there. Forbes did a survey recently of 50 very large companies and found that over 35 of them are using Hyperledger Fabric or Fabric-derived versions, and then even more of them are using some of the other projects at Hyperledger. So really a good sense that we're becoming kind of that Linux kind of dominant play here. Here in China, we have a lot of great members, a lot of great support. As I mentioned, the major organizations that run clouds are all not only supporting Fabric, but also members of ours. But you'll also see, and it might be hard from the screen from that distance, a lot of other types of large organizations like Lenovo or JD.com, very big e-commerce plays. Companies in the supply chain space like H3C, a lot of banks like China Minsheng Bank, China CITIC Bank, and a lot of interesting organizations, and another one called Beijing Genomics Institute that I'll mention in a bit, but as well as a lot of startups in the energy sector, in the healthcare sector, lots of folks who are pulling this together. We've also pulled together a real collection of the different universities here, Peking University, Zhejiang University, as well as the Chinese Academy of Information and Communication Technologies, which is the predominant organization in the Chinese government setting blockchain policy for the companies and here in China and for the nation. But the heart of what we do has got to be about developers, right? At the heart of every Linux Foundation project, it doesn't matter how much press coverage you're getting, how much corporate interest you're getting, or momentum out there, unless you're actually getting code written. And from the very beginning of the project, when I first joined, just after it started in 2016, I came to Shanghai for a Ethereum developer conference hosted just across the river, and started to meet a lot of people who were thinking about the application of blockchain tech to the enterprise. That's where we really got started and recognized that China needed to have a first-class position in the blockchain space and in Hyperledger, and that Hyperledger needed to be a global technology. And so in addition to all those members, we also have a tremendous amount of software coming in from developers here in China, about 15% as best we can tell, because sometimes it's hard to tell where contributions come from. But also many of the projects in Hyperledger, like Caliper, which is a benchmarking tool, actually started as projects written originally by developers here in China. And a key part of that outreach as well has been engagement through meetups, engagement through kind of face-to-face small events that we've done. In March, we did what we called a boot camp in Hong Kong, which had quite a bit of participation from developers in China. And our boot camps are really designed not to just be a hackathon or a training environment, but intended to try to help bring the developer community along with understanding how to become a contributor to the project, right? How do we get past the language barriers? How do we get past the cultural barriers? How do we really engage with the global Hyperledger open source community, if only to get our questions answered or our bugs fixed, but really hopefully to become co-developers on that. So look for future boot camps soon, and also we do quite a few of these meetups and gatherings in Shanghai and in Hangzhou, in Shenzhen, and I think 15 different cities have had Hyperledger events now, so watch for that. I have a series of 4 different examples of where people out there are using it. Please download the presentation deck. I'm not going to have the chance to go through all of them. Very quickly, JD.com built a blockchain network to provide a lot of different functionality in finance, in supply chain traceability, and in settling legal disputes. They actually built a system that talks to the Guangzhou Internet Court system, so that contracts and agreements between businesses doing business in Guangzhou can be presented presented as evidence in a court trial, so that you know that you're looking at all the right evidence, and it's all time-stamped, and those stamps are stored on the blockchain network. Tencent Cloud launched a really interesting project around warehouse receipts and being able to finance them, and they saw a lot of advantages that you would expect from digitalizing an otherwise paper-based process. But the key thing here is that blockchain technology is being used to replace things like signatures on pieces of paper and faxes and phone calls and all of this really heavy-duty overhead that otherwise we depend upon humans to do with each other. And that's so that we can get to a sense of trust. Lots of other big projects that without the time to talk about in trade finance, also in genetics, being able to trace the ownership of data and where it comes from and have people given the permission to properly analyze that data in the search for cures for cancer, all this amazing stuff. And it's all happening here in China. And it's happening on Hyperledger technologies. And it's really exciting to be a part of this big thing together. So lots more information available at the Hyperledger website, as well as a lot of us are very reachable on all sorts of systems, including WeChat. So please get involved. And hopefully we can talk about your project here on stage next year. Thank you.